The clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, very proper.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the December 12, 2018 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward, and once again I have Michael Abdullah and Andrew DeGrazia with me. Good evening, gentlemen.
G'day, Pete. How you going?
Great.
Good evening, all.
Good evening, all. Well, we're going to start on again. We've had a torrent of space news, and we've got some more for you now. It looks like Australia's first commercial orbital launch facility might be built in South Australia as soon as next year. New space company Southern Launch will begin developing infrastructure to deploy nano-satellites from the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia. Southern Launch CEO Lloyd Damp said last week that after an 18-month search for the perfect spot, the company found a site at Whalers Way on the Southern Eyre Peninsula for its launch pad. We looked at sites from Western Australia to Victoria that were suitable for Southern Launch and provided the right safety for people and the environment, said Damp. Besides offering the ability to launch rockets into polar or sun-synchronous orbit, we also needed to have access to major infrastructure like ports and airports. Called the Whalers Way Orbital Launch Complex, the 1,190-hectare site sits about 35 minutes' drive from the regional centre of Port Lincoln. Damp said the startup was in discussions with domestic and international rocket manufacturers to begin designing and developing the necessary infrastructure at its site for their launch vehicles and would begin construction in early 2019, with the aim of being operational by the end of the year. Southern Launch will target rockets with payloads between 50 and 400 kilograms, like Rocket Lab's Electron, that carry microsatellites to polar or sun-synchronous orbits to service Internet of Things applications such as monitoring agricultural land. Southern Launch is working with the South Australian Government, the Australian Space Agency and other regulators to work through regulations and assessments needed to launch from the site. And in more regional space news, Rocket Lab will carry out its next Electron launch, possibly by the end of this week. The company said last week that the launch from New Zealand is scheduled for a window opening from December 13 Australian time and running through to December 21. The launch will carry 10 CubeSats arranged by NASA through its Venture Class Launch Services program. Rocket Lab, which gives each launch its own name, is calling this mission This One's for Pickering, after William Pickering, the New Zealand native who was a director of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at the dawn of the space age. Angelo.
Okay, thanks, Peter. To the International Space Station. A Soyuz spacecraft carrying 3 people arrived at the International Space Station early last week, 6 hours after it was launched. The Soyuz MS-11 spacecraft docked with the station's Poisk module, with hatches between the Soyuz and station opening about 2 hours later. Significantly, this was the first Soyuz spacecraft to carry people since the MS-10 mission abort in October. The Soyuz, which lifted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, brought to the station Russian cosmonaut Oleg Kononenko, American astronaut Anne McClain, and Canadian astronaut David St. Jacques, where they will stay for the next 6.5 months. Meanwhile, the crew of the previously aborted Soyuz flight to the International Space Station have a new mission assignment. NASA announced last week that NASA astronaut Nick Hague and Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexei Ovchinin will fly to the station on the Soyuz MS-12 spacecraft, scheduled to launch on February 28 next year. They will be joined by NASA astronaut Christina Hammock-Koch, who had been previously assigned to the flight. Moving on to NASA commercial crew. NASA and SpaceX have agreed to move the target launch date of the uncrewed Demo 1 flight to the International Space Station. SpaceX has coordinated with the Eastern Range for a launch on Thursday, January 17, a slip of 10 days from the January 7 date we recently reported. This adjustment allows the return of the Cargo Dragon spacecraft from the company's current and 16th commercial resupply service mission. SpaceX's Demo 1 will provide key data associated with the ground, integrated rocket and spacecraft, and autonomous docking systems and the landing profile ahead of the company's flight test with astronauts known as DM2 or Demo 2. We still have more work to do as the certification process, hardware development and readiness reviews continue, said Kathy Lauders, manager of the NASA Commercial Crew Program. The upcoming steps before the test missions are critical and their importance can't be understated. We are not driven by dates but by data, she went on to say. All right, Michael.
Okay, let's look at NASA, lunar and planetary. Backers of missions to Jupiter's moon Europa are preparing for a future without their political patron. Development of the Europa Clipper spacecraft and follow-on lander have been supported and well funded by Representative John Culberson, Republican Texas, chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee that funds NASA. Culberson, you'll recall, lost re-election last month, and now backers are worried that Congress will not be as willing to fund the mission as much as before. Among the potential changes is shifting Europa Clipper, now scheduled for a mid-2023 launch, from the Space Launch System to the less powerful but also less expensive Falcon Heavy. NASA's OSIRIS-REx spacecraft officially arrived at the asteroid Bennu last week. The spacecraft fired its thrusters early last week to slow its approach to the asteroid, formally beginning operations in the vicinity of the body. OSIRIS-REx will enter orbit around Bennu on December 31 and survey the asteroid, eventually collecting a sample from the asteroid's surface that it will return to Earth in 2023. And NASA's InSight spacecraft is working well on Mars in the days since its landing recently. The solar-powered spacecraft set a record for the most electrical power generated in a single day last week, giving the spacecraft more than enough to carry out early checkout activities on the surface. InSight is returning images of its landing site to help scientists and engineers determine the best locations to install its main instruments, a seismometer and a heat flow probe. Angelo.
Okay, SpaceX. SpaceX successfully launched 64 satellites, including one for Australia's Fleet Space Technologies, on a Falcon 9 early last week. The rocket lifted off from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California after a delay of 2 weeks caused by technical issues and poor weather. The launch was the first time a Falcon 9 first stage had performed 3 launches, and the stage made another successful landing on the drone ship, just read the instructions, offshore. The 2 fairings were also recovered from the ocean, having missed the capture ship. SpaceX has indicated that despite landing in the sea, they may be reused. Interesting. SpaceX successfully launched a cargo spacecraft to the International Space Station last week, but failed to stick the booster landing. The Falcon 9 lifted off from Cape Canaveral and deployed the CRS-16 Dragon spacecraft into orbit 10 minutes later. The rocket's first stage was intended to land back at Cape Canaveral's Landing Zone 1, but a problem with the booster's grid fins caused it to spin up during descent, and the stage instead touched down in the ocean a few kilometres offshore. The ocean landing is deliberate in case of an emergency such as this. This was the first time that SpaceX failed to land a booster on a launch where it attempted a landing since the failed landing of the center booster core of the Falcon Heavy in February, and the first failed landing for a Falcon 9 first stage in more than 2 years. The Dragon, carrying more than 2,500 kilograms of scientific payload and other supplies, arrived safely at the International Space Station over the weekend. The failed landing appears unlikely to delay the upcoming SpaceX missions. Company officials said that a hydraulic pump used by the grid fins failed and that the system didn't have a backup. SpaceX may add a backup system on future boosters, but only after completing an investigation into the failure. The next Falcon 9 mission, launching the first GPS-3 satellite in December 18, won't attempt a landing in order to preserve the booster's performance for the payload. The next launch to attempt a landing will be for the final group of 10 Iridium Next satellites, a launch scheduled for no earlier than December 30, but which may slip into January for other reasons. Peter.
All right, well, wrapping up this week, a new Neil Armstrong documentary will feature footage never seen before, including some shot by Armstrong himself. The documentary Armstrong includes home videos taken by Armstrong as well as unseen footage from NASA archive to tell the story of the life of the first person to set foot on the moon. The documentary, by the same producers as The Last Man on the Moon and Mission Control, The Unsung Heroes of Apollo, both of which we've seen and love, is scheduled for release next year to mark the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. And that's it for this week, gentlemen. Thank you very much, and it's back to you, Andrew.